Hello, everybody, and welcome to our TOGAF webinar. We'll start now. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your interest in joining this very interesting webinar today about TOGAF and other major IT frameworks. A little introduction, I'll be your host today. My name is Lawrence Gunneweg, and I'm a product manager at ITpreneurs. We are a training delivery company, and we work closely together with Global Knowledge in bringing you the best training experience in the industry. Before we start, I would like to just check if you can all hear me to see if there aren't any audio complications. So I'll just launch this quick poll to check. Please fill it out. And I think about everybody has responded right now. Let's see the results. Yes, perfect. Okay. This webinar will last approximately 1.5 hours. 1 hour and a quarter presentations and 15 minutes for questions at the end. As there are literally hundreds of attendees, you will be placed in mute mode. But of course you can pose questions through the presentation. We will answer these at the end in the order they came in. So please use the chat function or the question function in the webinar menu toggle on the right. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available publicly afterwards, so you can view it again and send it to your colleagues. And just for your interest, we're also planning on releasing a white paper on the same subject later this year. So we'll keep you posted on that, of course. Now I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to our presenter for today. Danny Greefhorst is a lead architect and master trainer for ITpreneurs TOGAF portfolio. And he has over a decade of experience in enterprise architecture. He's a director and consultant for his own company, ArchiXL, in the Netherlands. And of course, he has instructed many enterprise architecture courses, mainly TOGAF, but also other frameworks. He also has experience with, of course, PRINCE2 and ITIL and COBIT. Otherwise, he wouldn't be speaking about it today. And he's the chair of Via Nova Architectura in the Netherlands, a board member of the Dutch Computer Society. He has won several awards and he has written books and articles. You can look it up on his LinkedIn, of course, and on his website. So without anything else, I will now hand it over to Danny to introduce you to the agenda for today. So enjoy your webinar.
Okay, so welcome everybody. So this is the agenda for today. I'll start the presentation with a quick introduction to architecture for those of you who are not really familiar with that. I'll be spending some time telling you about TOGAF and everything that's in there. And then we'll zoom into the relationship of TOGAF with a number of frameworks. So we specifically will look at ITIL, COBIT, and PRINCE2. Could be that it also depends on the time, on how much time we still spend on PRINCE2. And at the end, we also have room for questions. So here's a quick poll. We're interested in what's your experience in using these frameworks. So could you please try to answer this poll? Okay, for some reason I'm not seeing the results here, but I'm sure the organizer will tell me what it is. So we'll continue with the actual presentation.
Sorry, Danny, the results are here. It's 85% ITIL, and TOGAF, COBIT, PRINCE2 roughly a third. So most experience is with ITIL, so that will help you with your presentation, I think.
Okay, thank you. So we'll start with introducing architecture, which, given the audience, maybe a new subject for a number of you. So what is architecture? Well, that's a difficult question. When we talk about architecture, we're mainly talking about enterprise architecture here. Although there are also other terms that are associated with it, such as business architecture, process architecture, infrastructure architecture, IT architecture. And also, there's a lot of different views on what all these things are. So the definition you see here on your screen is one of the most popular ones. It's very much coming from the software architecture community. And this one is very focused on showing that architecture is essentially about the structure of a system. So that's the core. It's about a system. It's about the relationship that the elements have with each other. And it's also about thinking about the evolution of the system. So that's a very specific view on architecture. Others, however, have totally different views. For example, Jan Dietz has written several papers and books, and he is very much more focused on restriction of design freedom, which is, it's not about structure. It's about design and restricting design and providing guidance to design. And also, actually describing architecture is much more about describing principles, and it's not about describing models. So that's a totally different view, you could say, on architecture. And there are even other definitions out there, such as this one. It's one of my favorites. It says that, so this is basically from Len Veskens. And Len says, well, hey, we need to really think again about what architecture is, because, a lot of things out there are not really focused on what's really important. So architecture should really be about those things that are really important, the things that are really necessary and sufficient. So that mostly provides you with a mindset, thinking about the things that are actually very important. It's not like it's a mathematical thing you can do. It's more like something you should try to find in consensus with other people you're confronted with. And this is even another definition. This one is by Jeff Scott. And he says, architecture is mainly about managing the execution of the corporate strategy. So this one really shows that architecture, especially enterprise architecture, is very close to the strategy. So it's actually trying to make the corporate strategy more concrete and ensuring that it actually happens. So that's much more a strategic view if you compare it, for example, to the ISO definition. Again, I said there are various types of architecture people talk about, but the most general term people use is enterprise architecture. And the main characteristic of enterprise architecture is that it's very much trying to combine all the various views. So it starts at, say, the business level, talking about process architecture, product architecture, and then tries to link that to information systems, information, and technology. So enterprise architecture is not so much about describing certain things in detail. It's much more about providing the overall perspective, seeing how things relate in general, aligning things, describing those things that are really important, and providing you with an overview in which you can link all these aspects. So, for example, you could do an impact analysis. Say, we want to introduce a new product. What does that really mean for our processes and for our information systems? So it's also very much, you could say, like an analytical view on the world. So on this slide, we try to summarize why architecture would be important. And I think there are three most the most important things you can say about that, it's about alignment. So it's very much about aligning strategy to operations, but also business demand to business supply, and ensuring that everything that changes is in line with what we really want. A somewhat different perspective is that it also provides insight. So it provides insight into how we are currently organized, and it also provides insight into how we should be organized. And this organization, again, reflects all the views we have in enterprise architecture. So it's about organization, it's about information systems, and it's about technology and how these things are related. And the final thing is that architecture also helps you improving quality. So in the end, architecture will lead to solutions, which could be software systems or hardware systems, but it could also be like organizations. And what we try to do with architecture is that we try to formulate requirements, and these requirements will focus on the things that are really important and ensure that the core qualities that we need are really there in the event in the solution. So the focus of this presentation is not only in TOGAF, but very much also on how TOGAF is related to all other types of IT frameworks. And what we did was we tried to look at some of the most important, the most popular frameworks that are out there. So there's COBIT, ITIL, and there's PRINCE2 that we looked at. So these frameworks are very different. They describe very different aspects, but they are also very much related. So we will try to look at the relationships between these frameworks. And this picture is trying to show you, say, the high-level positioning. So in terms of what happens in general, you see that when we want to change things, we first need to provide the overall direction. And this is basically where COBIT is strong. COBIT is much more, it's more about governance and directing. TOGAF provides you with a high-level view on what changes are needed. And the actual changes are implemented in PRINCE2. And then, in the end, everything also needs to well, be moved into operations. And that's one of the areas in which ITIL is strong. So this is the overall positioning of the frameworks. And then, of course, we also want to know, okay, so what are the main interactions between these frameworks? So starting with COBIT, we see that COBIT really is very much focused on providing guidance in how to govern IT, and in relationship to TOGAF, also how to govern enterprise architecture. So it provides you with all sorts of views that really help you with that. Then looking at PRINCE2, we see that it really can help you manage projects in general, and architecture projects using TOGAF, of course, should also be managed. So PRINCE2 can help you manage your architecture project. Another thing that is relevant is that when you do an enterprise architecture engagement, you come up with all sorts of things that are really needed to fulfill the strategy. Changes that need to be implemented, and these changes are typically implemented in the form of projects. So what this will lead to is that we will end up with project briefs that will start up new projects that can be handled with PRINCE2. And then the last framework we're talking about is ITIL. So ITIL is very much about IT service management. So what you see is that ITIL is really on two sides. It's on the strategy side. So there it provides already high-level input for enterprise architecture engagements, but it's also at a more detailed level. It's also very much about the operational side. And there we talk about things such as configuration items. So it provides a very detailed perspective on things. So TOGAF, you could say, sort of fits in the middle. It translates the IT strategy that is formulated using ITIL, and then translates that to a more technical level. And this technical level is basically expressed in the form of principles and models. So these principles are high-level statements that provide direction, and these models are basically high-level design types of things. So I also have a little bit more detailed picture there, and I'm not sure whether you're all able to see all and read all text in this picture, but it basically zooms into the three main areas that were in the previous slide. So here you see that at the direct level, we basically have two things. So we have like governance. So that's like providing direction to how actually decisions are made in organizations, and how, say, like senior management really wants to control everything. And then we have like strategic planning, which is much more about, okay, what are the actual goals that we want to strive for, and how do we actually formulate a plan in order to attain these goals? Those two things are then translated to what's visualized in the change area. And that's where enterprise architecture comes in. Enterprise architecture takes these goals and this high-level roadmap and tries to make it more concrete. It tries to show you the impact that these goals have. It shows you that when you want to introduce a new product or want to change a certain process, that it has a certain impact on IT, and that other more specific changes are needed. Then that typically leads to projects, and these projects typically go through project portfolio management, and that's where change initiatives get a certain priority, and they are planned in time, and this will lead to the actual projects that will make these changes. And in these projects, there will be design and implementation activity. And this design and implementation activity is what you basically provide direction to using enterprise architecture. So architecture principles and architecture models provide direction to design. It provides constraints. So it shows you the boundaries within which this design should take place. And it already provides a high-level design. And in the end, the design and implementation leads to new operations and the management of these operations. And when we're talking about IT, of course, a lot of these operations is related to IT operations and IT service management. So this is the more detailed perspective on, say, the primary processes involved in changing IT. So now we talked about architecture in general. I've told you that enterprise architecture is very much about aligning all these perspectives, about translating the strategy into more concrete things. Let's now see what TOGAF does. So TOGAF is a framework for enterprise architecture. And framework is a very generic term. It's meant to say that it provides you with a structure of thinking about enterprise architecture. And in more particular, it provides you with a set of processes that show you how to actually do it. In addition, it also provides you with techniques and guidelines, and it provides you with a description of the actual products that are developed in an enterprise architecture engagement. The TOGAF standard is something that has been around now for quite a number of years, and important is that it's an open standard. So it's owned by the Open Group, which is basically a consortium of organizations. So there's a large number of organizations that are a member of the Open Group, and they come from various sources. So there's like consulting companies, but there's also user companies and even academic and research types of companies. And when we look in the markets, and I work mostly in the Netherlands, so that's an important view for me. I see that TOGAF is really the primary method and standard that I see in the enterprise architecture field. TOGAF is still very generic, so it's a collection of best and common practices that you can bind to actually determine what to do in your own organization. So it's something that you still need to tailor to your own organization. You need to determine which things you will actually do and how it actually fits into all your other processes. So that's where also the relationship with all these other IT frameworks comes in. So this is the overall structure of TOGAF. TOGAF consists of a number of parts. So the core of TOGAF is what's here in the middle, and it's called the Architecture Development Method. And this is basically the core process. It describes the steps and the phases that are important. It also contains a set of guidelines and techniques that will actually help you perform these phases and steps. So they tell you, for example, how to do migration planning. They tell you how to formulate architecture principles. So they make the method more concrete. The next part in TOGAF is the architecture content framework. The architecture content framework is a description of all the products that are needed in an enterprise architecture engagement. There are basically two types of products that are relevant. A number of products are very much around the process, about governing enterprise architecture and governing an enterprise architecture engagement. And there are products that are very much focused on, say, the actual content of the enterprise architecture. They describe what an enterprise architecture actually looks like. Then we have the enterprise continuum and tools. That's basically a toolbox that shows you the types of architectures that are typically developed by companies. And it also provides you with a set of reference models. So that's actually a separate part. So these reference models you can use as a starting point for developing your own architecture. The final part of TOGAF is visualized on top. It's the architecture capability framework. And this framework shows you how to actually organize architecture. So it shows you the types of roles, the types of people, the skills, and also how architecture governance fits into IT governance in general. The heart of TOGAF is really the architecture development method. So this development method shows you the steps and the phases that you need to really perform. So it shows you that you first need to think about, okay, how to actually organize things. That's what you do in the preliminary phase. That you then need to go into a vision phase in which you show and in which you sketch a high-level view of the architecture. Then you go into several phases that provide a more detailed description of the architecture. And then you go into a number of phases that really translate the architecture into a plan that is input for project portfolio management. And in the middle, we see requirements management as well, an important thing to drive the architecture. It's important to show and to tell you that this is not really meant as a waterfall approach. So really, you can go through all these phases in various ways. So it's very much iterative, and it's basically in the preliminary phase where you determine the actual steps that you will take in the order in which you will take them and how many times you will revisit them. So this is really the core of TOGAF. In the most recent version of TOGAF, so that's TOGAF 9.1, we have the architecture content framework. This may be a little bit hard to read, but what this diagram tries to show you is say, like all the various products that you can actually make. So these products are typically diagrams or catalogs, like lists of things, or matrices in which you show relationships between things. And these things are also very much divided into the main architecture domains that TOGAF describes. So TOGAF talks about business architecture as a domain. Business architecture is very much about how to organize your business. Data architecture, which is very much on how to organize your data. Application architecture, which is about your applications. And technology architecture, which is about your infrastructure. And all these models you can use to show various aspects of these architecture domains. So they are a means for actually providing the insight into the organization of things. What you will do in practice is that you will come up with a subset of these. You will try to select those products that are actually relevant for the architecture engagement that you are in. And that can be very different. So for example, if you're very much implementing an IT strategy, you will probably focus on the application and technology side. But if you're very much into, say, translating a business strategy, then there will also be very much focus on the business architecture. So it's very much depending on the context. Again, we have a quick poll. And the question is, have you implemented TOGAF?
Danny, the results are 89% no. So there's not a lot of experience with the TOGAF yet.
Okay. Well, hopefully at the end of this presentation, people will change their mind. So let's continue. So now we have described what architecture is, and we've shown you what TOGAF is. So TOGAF is very much a framework that provides you with a description of the steps, of the processes, and that also shows you the products that are actually relevant when you do an enterprise architecture engagement. So let's now look at service management, especially IT service management. So that's where ITIL comes in. So what is ITIL? Well, most of you know already what ITIL is, so we should not dive into this too deeply. But it's also very much a process framework, and it's a UK government standard, so that's important. And it basically comes from more the operational side, but when you look at it at the current version, and the most recent version is ITIL version 2011, you see that it's very broad already. So there's like 26 different processes described in all sorts of areas. It's organized into 5 core books, and these core books are, well, very elaborate. So it's a very elaborate framework. So this is an overview of the main things that are in there. So we have 4 main stages. Service strategy. So that's where we have like the strategic view on what to do. Of course, it includes the actual formulation of the strategy, which in case of ITIL is the service strategy, which is a subset of the IT strategy. And it also includes other more strategic processes, such as, well, looking at portfolios, the portfolio of your services, looking at managing the finances, managing demand, and managing relationships. Then there's a bit that's very much about the design, so how to actually formulate the things that need to change. What you see here, there's like a core process, design coordination, that is meant to coordinate all the types of design activities in there. And we have very specific types of processes that have a design aspect, but also include other aspects. So things like availability management, they include a design aspect for actually designing for availability, but they also include like transition and operations aspects, because you also need to actually manage this availability. So you see that the positioning of these processes within these stages is not entirely one-to-one. So in design, we basically determine how to actually organize things. In transition, we go to the actual implementation. And in operation, we are actually running our business and our IT services. And we look at things that are going on, incidents that may occur, requests that users may have, problems that we may need to look at. And at the bottom, we see continual service improvements. So the idea that we actually continuously need to look at how these processes work and whether we need to improve them. So that's about ITIL in general. So the focus of this presentation is, how does ITIL then relate to TOGAF? So these are the most important things I want to say about that. First, you could say that ITIL is also an architecture. It's basically an architecture for IT service management. Because, well, IT service management is an area in itself. It provides you with all sorts of perspectives. It provides you with a process perspective. So that's like what's in the previous slide. But it also provides you with perspectives on the information involved, the information systems involved, and even a little bit about the technology needed, and how all these things relate. So in itself, that's an important insight. And that may also mean that some of the things that we do with TOGAF and the processes that are within TOGAF may also be relevant when we look at ITIL and IT service management. So actually, for example, the governance side of architecture, that may also be relevant when you look at IT service management. So you could use architecture governance to really also govern IT service management. Another area in which they relate is that both frameworks provide some form of guidance for design. So TOGAF is very much focused on the enterprise architecture level, which is still a design type of level. And then ITIL provides you with a somewhat more detailed perspective. So it basically elaborates on the level that is defined using TOGAF. Another relationship these frameworks have is that if you actually develop an architecture with TOGAF, you see that it has all sorts of relationships with the ITIL processes. So, well, the most important thing we talked about, so basically the architecture itself will be translated to a more detailed design, but there are also other relationships that we'll see later on. And the final view, the final relationship that we see is that both ITIL and TOGAF talk about certain repositories, so places that we need to administer things. And both repositories are relevant, and they also contain things that are similar. So, for example, when you talk about IT services, both the architecture repository and the repository that is suggested in ITIL contain information on that. So we need to think about how to actually relate these repositories. This slide really shows you that design is something that exists at several levels. So in TOGAF, we already talk about 3 levels. So we talk about the strategic level, where we have a very high-level architecture that will look ahead, well, quite some time, is very broad. And then we also have segment architectures that focus on specific areas within the business or IT. So you could have, like, for example, a customer relationship management segment, which is more like a business type of segment. But you could also have like an identity management segment, which is very much an IT segment. So there we start zooming in to specific things, providing more specific principles and models, showing what actually goes on around there and what is needed to change. And then there's a more detailed architecture in TOGAF that is called the capability architecture, that is even closer to the actual solutions that are needed. When you look at the ITIL side, although the terminology here in the slide is not so specifically mentioned, but basically you could say that ITIL provides you with 2 levels. So there is like a solution architecture level, which is still a very broad level, but it's very much about, okay, we actually need this IT service and we need a solution for that. So how to actually do that, and you typically do that in a project. So we're already within a project here. Later on, we actually need to further define more detailed elements, how to actually handle availability. And we really need to zoom into more elements there. So you see there's really a progression from a very high level to a more detailed level. And all these design levels, well, they talk about IT services in some way. I already see a question coming here about the segment framework. So the question is, how does that relate to what you're talking about? For those people who are not aware, the segment framework is a very popular framework. It's also what a lot of people think was the first framework, but actually it's not. So there has been a framework before that. That framework is called PRISM. But the segment framework basically provides you only with what TOGAF calls the content framework. So it only shows you the types of things that you actually model. And it does not really describe the process. So that's, I think, the most important thing to say about that. Okay, then zooming into the repository thing. TOGAF talks about the architecture repository. Maybe not everything on the slide is readable, but what's most important here is that architecture repository is a very high-level thing. It's a concept. It's basically saying that everything that you do when you're doing an enterprise architecture engagement is reflected in this repository. So it's something that provides you with important stuff upfront. So it provides you with a reference library. So that's all sorts of external reference models that you have adopted. It shows you all the standards that you have chosen for. It also describes, okay, your own decisions on how to actually do architecture. So that's mostly what's in the architecture meta model. And then the actual architectures are also stored in this repository. And what you also see is that it also contains a place in which you actually store everything that happens around the governance of architecture. So all decisions that are made, everything basically that needs to be registered that is relevant in respect to enterprise architecture. So this is a very broad perspective. So we already see here things that we need to refine later on, and that will end up in other types of repositories. So when we look at ITIL, for example, we see that it defines the concept of a service knowledge management system. So this is also a very high-level concept, you could say. Very comparable to architecture repository in TOGAF. So it also talks about all sorts of things that could be in there. It shows you, for example, the configuration management system. That's the real source of information on the actual IT services, and which is physically stored in the form of configuration management databases. But it also shows you a number of information systems on availability, on contracts. So all sorts of information in here. So the real challenge, I think, is how to really connect this to what's in the architecture repository. So that's basically this picture. So what I see is that there is a higher level concept, something we call an enterprise repository, that combines all these things that are in an architecture repository and in the service knowledge management system, and specifically in the configuration management system. When you do architecture, so you are mainly confronted with this architecture repository, but still, if you start defining your architecture, you will start with defining what is called the baseline architecture. So the baseline architecture is basically the representation of the current situation. And the most current situation should be in the configuration management system. So ideally, there is an interface between the configuration management system and the architecture repository in which you can actually import or maybe even in real time see what's in the configuration management system and use that as the basis for your baseline architecture. Of course, you also need to abstract from that, so you need to create a more logical level, because what's in the configuration management system, that can be a large number of things, and that can be very detailed things in there. So we need a higher level view of that. That's what we typically do in the architecture. And that's also at the level in which we can talk about the difference between, okay, what do we have now and what do we need in the future? So if we now have like 5 types of customer relationship management systems, and we say, well, in the future we only want to have 1, that's the type of thing we talk about at the enterprise architecture level. And if that's what is the result, then that should also lead to more detailed design on the ITIL side, and in the end it needs to end up with detailed specification of the IT services that are needed for that. So ideally, there should also be an interface back from the architecture repository to the configuration management system. So actually what we have done is, we've made such interfaces. What we have done is we have used semantic wiki technology for that. So that's basically a very simple technology for doing so. But a lot of commercial products also have interfaces that will let you do so. So we now talked about how TOGAF is related to ITIL. So the other framework we will look at now is COBIT. And COBIT is very much on governance. So COBIT is also a process framework in the sense that it provides you with a description of a lot of processes. And in the most recent version of COBIT, which is COBIT version 5, you see that there's a very broad perspective. And the processes that are described in COBIT, they concern not only the governance itself, but also in more general way, managing your IT. So you could say it describes all relevant processes. So it's sort of an umbrella for everything that is relevant for IT. And it's an umbrella in the sense that it only provides you with a high-level perspective. So it does not provide you with all the details, but it really shows you how all these processes are related. And it also very much shows you how to actually govern these things. So what is the governance structure that you need to actually execute these processes? So there's a number of principles also in COBIT. So COBIT is very much focused on actually looking at what stakeholders need. It's very much focused on, okay, looking at the enterprise from an end-to-end perspective. And in COBIT version 5 specifically, it's very much about, okay, we need to look at governance separate from management. So governance is very much on, okay, how should decisions actually be made? And how should we really look at what we're doing from a high-level perspective, the perspective of senior management? While the management perspective is much more about, okay, given that we have defined this governance structure and that we have defined these processes, let's really do this then, and let's actually ensure that it happens. So what's also very much core in COBIT is that it's very driven by goals. And it starts at the enterprise level, so it reasons about enterprise goals. So there's a predefined set of enterprise goals, but it also translates that down to the IT level. So it also provides you with a predefined set of IT-related goals. And that's also what you see related to all these processes. So all these processes are related to the goals, and so you can look at it from the perspective of, say, I have a certain goal. Then you can look at the predefined list of goals in COBIT and say, okay, that basically maps to this enterprise goal, and it maps to this IT goal. And then TOGAF will tell you which IT processes are really relevant for actually ensuring that you reach these goals. COBIT itself is described in a number of documents. So there's like the overall document. There's a document that describes all the processes in a little bit more detail. And there's also an implementation guidance document that will actually help you implement COBIT and IT governance in a general way. ISACA is the organization that is actually the manager, you could say, of the standard. So again, here we have a picture that attempts to show you a lot of things in one. So I hope everyone can read it. But this is an overview of all the processes that are described in COBIT. And what you see at the top are the 5 processes that are related to governance, or specifically IT governance. So you see that governance is very much related to, well, setting the framework, but it's also very much about ensuring benefits, ensuring risks are managed, ensuring that resources are optimized, and ensuring that there's transparency towards stakeholders. So all these things is what we call governance. And all the other things are what we call IT management then. And these IT management processes are also clustered. So when you look at the thing that's on top there, align, plan, and organize. So you could say that these are at the more strategic and more tactical level. And this is also where we find enterprise architecture. So there is a managed enterprise architecture process in COBIT. And we also see a number of other processes that are very much related to the high-level picture we presented earlier. So for example, we had a strategic planning process in one of the first slides, and there's a managed strategy process in here. We had a project portfolio management process in our picture, and there's also a managed portfolio within here. We had like a design and implement type of process, and there's also a managed programs and projects process in here. So you see that this provides a very overall perspective on all processes that are relevant. So now let's now look at how this relates to TOGAF. So we have 3 important types of relationships. So we see that COBIT covers most of what TOGAF also covers. So you could say TOGAF is included in COBIT, but it's only included at a very high level. So actually they have taken quite a good look at TOGAF and they really tried to match that with all the other processes. So that's a good thing. What I like less about it is that they also have tried to change it a little bit. So they have reformulated a number of things, and they have renamed a number of products. So it's not entirely TOGAF anymore, what's in COBIT. So I think that's a little bit of a problem. It may also have to do with changes in TOGAF, but the other thing is that COBIT in general is about IT, whilst enterprise architecture ultimately is also about the business. And this is what we are striving for in general, but we must also admit that in practice, enterprise architecture and also TOGAF is also very much on IT. The other type of relationship we see here is that COBIT provides you with additional information, information that is not in TOGAF in itself. So it provides you with more information, information about the goals. So the goals that actually are attained trying to actually execute enterprise architecture. And it adds information on responsibilities that are relevant when you do enterprise architecture. So it provides you with a RACI chart that describes these responsibilities. And the final thing is that COBIT also provides you with a context for enterprise architecture. So it relates all the other processes that are relevant to enterprise architecture. So that allows you to better understand how enterprise architecture fits into all these other processes. So I here have a table that shows you how the TOGAF phases and activities are actually related to COBIT. So I will not describe this in detail, but what you see is that what they have done in COBIT is that they have combined certain things. So for example, in COBIT we have something called defining reference architectures, which is a combination of business architecture, information systems architecture, and technology architecture in TOGAF. And we also have something which is called architecture services in COBIT. And these architecture services are also a combination of several phases and activities in TOGAF. So they're basically a combination of what you call implementation governance, architecture change management, and requirements management. So here you see that they have tried to, well, come up with a little bit of different perspective. This slide I will not talk about in more detail, but it's only meant to show you what is provided in COBIT. So COBIT provides you with a number of goals that the process is actually trying to achieve, and it also provides you with a number of metrics. So when you want to do enterprise architecture at a certain maturity level, you need to define, say, key performance indicators for the enterprise architecture process. And COBIT really provides you with a starting point for that. So this is information that is not in TOGAF, but is in COBIT. So similar to the previous slides, I will also not tell you on detail what's in this slide, but it's meant to show you that the processes that are relevant for enterprise architecture, so these are the things that are on the left-hand side, so things such as defining reference architectures and providing enterprise architecture services, are in COBIT related to the types of people, the types of roles that are involved in the process and the responsibilities that they have. So here, for example, we can see that the Chief Executive Officer is basically accountable for developing the enterprise architecture vision. In general, you see that there's a lot of executive and management type of people involved in enterprise architecture. So that also is an indication that for enterprise architecture to really work, management and senior management commitment is really important. So this diagram can also help you actually implement architecture in your organization. So map these roles to the types of roles you have in your organization and ensure that these processes and roles are actually implemented and governed. So when you look at the Managed Enterprise Architecture process in COBIT, it also provides you with a view on the information that is exchanged with other processes, and of course also the processes themselves that are involved. So here we see, for example, that enterprise architecture receives outside of COBIT enterprise strategies and enterprise drivers. And from within COBIT, it provides information from the ensure resource optimization, the IT management framework, and managed strategy processes. And it provides more detailed information on the actual information exchange. And this type of information is not really included in TOGAF. So again, it really helps you to actually implement TOGAF and to actually connect TOGAF to all the other relevant processes in your organization. So COBIT provides a relevant addition to TOGAF. And this is the other way around, so it also shows you how the information and how the products that you actually construct in an enterprise architecture engagement are used in the other processes. So you see, for example, here that the managed strategy process also uses the architecture. So again, so there's a loop. So on one side, the strategy gives you the goals that you need to translate in your architecture, but the architecture itself is also input for the strategy. Well, I'll not tell you about all the things that are in here in detail, but again, this is very interesting information when you actually want to implement TOGAF. So now we talked about COBIT and how COBIT is related to TOGAF. The final subject we have in here is that we want to show you how TOGAF is really related to project management and to PRINCE2 in particular. So PRINCE2 is also a process framework. It's a structured way of actually performing project management. So there's a number of principles underlying PRINCE2, such as, well, we need a continued business justification, we need to learn from experience, we need defined roles and responsibilities, we need to manage by stages, we need to manage by exception, etc. PRINCE2 is also a UK government standard, so that's interesting. And well, you could say that the heart of PRINCE2 is a set of processes, in addition to the principles and a number of themes. So this picture, which shows you the 7 processes of PRINCE2, is really the core of PRINCE2. So when we talk through this at a very high level, you see that it all begins with starting up a project. And in there, we need to think about, okay, what is the type of project that we need? Directing a project is very much concerned with, say, the more governance type of level. We have initiating a project that is very much on, okay, how to actually formulate the project plan. And then we have stages that are concerned with things that happen at a later moment in time, such as moving from one stage to the other, ensuring that the right things happen in a stage, and actually closing a project and managing that the right products are delivered. So let's look at how these processes and how PRINCE2 in general is related to TOGAF. So both frameworks provide you with activities, practices, and deliverables for project management. So PRINCE2 is specifically aimed at that. It is primarily a project management method. But also, when you look at TOGAF, you see a number of activities and products that are also related to project management. So you could say TOGAF provides you with a sort of a lightweight project management framework. So that this lightweight project management framework may be sufficient for actually managing an architecture project, but it is not really recommended to use this as a more generic project management method. What you can do, on the other hand, is use PRINCE2 as a way to manage your TOGAF project. So when you look at it from that perspective, PRINCE2 activities and phases need to be integrated with the TOGAF phases and activities, and certain TOGAF products need to be exchanged with PRINCE2 products. Another thing we see is that when you define an architecture in using TOGAF, it ends up with the definition of projects that are actually needed to implement the strategy. And the architecture itself provides you with an initial definition of this project, and it also provides you with, say, the essential requirements that the project needs to take into account. The final relationship we see here is that when you actually perform the project and when you actually deliver products, these products, and especially the design level products, should also be checked for compliance with the architectures that you have defined using TOGAF. So this is basically what is called implementation governance in TOGAF. So you need to actually ensure that all changes are in line with what is really needed. This slide shows you how a number of products are related. And we talked about how TOGAF really includes a lightweight project management framework. So this is what is reflected mostly in this slide. You see that there's something which is called a request for architecture framework. And when you look at PRINCE2, that very much resembles what it's a project mandate. So it's basically what you get from your sponsor asking you well, to perform a project. And then what we do in TOGAF is we make up our own plan. And this plan is called the Statement of Architecture Work. And when you look at that, you see that it highly reflects what is typically in a project initiation document. So these things are highly comparable. In TOGAF, we have something called a communications plan. And of course, we also need to handle communications in general when you do a project. So there's a relationship there. We see that both in TOGAF and in PRINCE2, or in general in doing projects, we need to handle risks. So within PRINCE2, we have this risk register in which we need to look at all these risks and need to determine how to handle them. And on the TOGAF side, we have something which is called the implementation factor assessment and deduction matrix. So that's basically a very structured way of looking at all sorts of risks that are related to the architecture. So although we talk about risks on both sides, we see that the risks that we talk about can be different. They can also overlap. So when we talk about risks at the PRINCE2 side, we talk about project-related risks, whilst on the TOGAF side, we talk very much more about the risks in actually implementing things. So that's a little bit of a different perspective. Another relationship we see here is that a typical enterprise architecture engagement ends up with a plan that shows you what projects are actually needed. And these projects are described at a certain level. And when you look at that, you see that this level basically reflects the project brief level as described in PRINCE2. So you could say that the output of an enterprise architecture engagement is a set of project briefs, a set of project briefs that are recommended. of course, these project briefs also need to go through the project portfolio management process, where they need to be prioritized, and they need to be related, and they also need to be plotted in time. And the final relationship we show here is that, well, we talk about issues in general, and these issues are basically things we need to make a decision about. And that's also very similar on the TOGAF side. So also there we see a log of decisions. So what is basically shown here is that governing a project and governing architecture is very much related. So we have a separate group of people that is actually governing a project and a separate group of people that is actually governing architecture. So to make this really happen, we need to connect these two groups of people to ensure that the decisions made are actually in line and that there are proper escalation channels. This picture attempts to show you how the actual things that happen in a typical enterprise architecture engagement are related to the stages in PRINCE2. So when we start up a project, basically an important thing to do there is actually to define the scope of your project. So what's in scope, what are the processes, for example, that we change, and what's not in scope, so what is stable. And the enterprise architecture provides you with all sorts of models that you can use to express the scope of your project. So that's something that is very valuable from that perspective. When you actually initiate a project, so then you're further down the road, you want to make it more concrete, you actually construct your plan, and your plan will include, for example, mostly it will include a description of the activities, but it should also include the requirements that are important. And these requirements, well, an important source for these requirements is basically your architecture. So what you should do is translate your enterprise architecture into requirements for a project. And these requirements can be included in a project initiation document, or they can be in a separate document. So here, TOGAF talks about an architecture contract, but also other people talk about project start architectures here. So that's a different term for that. Further down the road, we're actually doing, we're inside stages, we're inside projects. All sorts of things happen in there. All sorts of exceptions can be generated. And these exceptions can be originated from the architecture. It can be that the project is attempting to do things that really violates what we have thought about in the enterprise architecture. So that's something that needs to be escalated to the governance level. And in order to really detect these exceptions, we need to have a process in place that will actually provide insight into these exceptions. So there needs to be a review process in place. So what you see is that within PRINCE2, there are basically two places in which some form of review takes place. So we have some like a more informal type of review inside the controlling stage, and we have a more formalized type of review in the managing product delivery. So this is where typically an architecture compliance review should be included. Again, at the governance level, so where actually directing a project is taking place, all these exceptions and issues should be handled, and decisions on them should be made. And the last thing we show in this picture is that when we close a project, we need to look at, okay, so what are the lessons learned here? These lessons learned can be related to very much the process thing, so the project management types of things, but they can also be related to architecture things. And what also can happen is that earlier on we have decided to deviate from the architecture, but only allow this deviation for a certain time. And that, for example, this deviation should be fixed at the end of the project. So we need to determine at the end of the project, are all these deviations actually fixed, or are there still open issues? And these open issues should be handled at some moment in time. And these can actually lead to new initiatives, new projects, and changes in the enterprise architecture. So this is really a recap of what we talked about. We talked about quite a lot of things, really. So this picture tries to show you the essence of what we talked about. So we talked about what is architecture. Architecture is about alignments. It's about insight, and it's about improving quality. We talked about TOGAF. On that, TOGAF is a framework that provides you with a process, and it provides you with a content framework, something that describes you what the actual products look like. And we talked about 3 important other frameworks. We talked about COBIT, we talked about PRINCE2, and we talked about ITIL. We have seen that from COBIT, there's a lot of information on how to actually govern things. And this information is really an enrichment from what is in TOGAF. So you can really learn from COBIT in performing enterprise architecture. We see that when you do PRINCE2, you have a very professional way of doing project management, and which is a more professional way than the more lightweight project management approach that's actually included in TOGAF. We've seen that TOGAF, or in general enterprise architecture engagements, end up with suggested projects to execute at the level of project briefs. And then in relation to ITIL, we have seen that ITIL starts already at the strategic level, provides you with the overall direction, with the goals. That is something that we need to translate in TOGAF into more concrete things, into principles and models. And these principles and models are then later on refined in the ITIL service design process, and they will end up with configuration items. And these things are also, this loop is also reflected in the fact that the repositories that really support these processes should also be connected. So that ends us here with the opportunity for you to ask questions. So I think this is also where Lawrence will help me a little bit more.
Yes, thank you, Danny, for your wonderful presentation. I realize it's a lot of content for just over an hour webinar. So yeah, we'll make this recorded version, of course, available for you to view again and to share with colleagues. And also, we're planning on delivering the white paper on this subject, which is a lot more in depth. So be on the lookout for that. And even in the meanwhile, you can ask questions right now about any of these topics. So please feel free to ask questions in the question menu. I see that we already have some frequently asked questions. Maybe, Danny, you can just answer the first one here.
Okay, well, the first one is easy, you could say, because how to actually start with implementing TOGAF is described in TOGAF itself. So that's basically what's described in the preliminary phase. So the preliminary phase is where you think about how to actually do architecture, how to organize things, what sort of people you need, the roles that they need to have, the competence that are needed. Of course, it's all about people. So we need to think about, okay, how to ensure that we have people with the right skills. This is also where training becomes relevant, TOGAF training, of course. And it's also where you actually can tailor TOGAF itself. So you can tailor TOGAF and ensure that the processes are really aligned to your own processes. Well, basically, this presentation provides you with a lot of inspiration for that. But you can also tailor, for example, the terminology and the actual content. So it may be that you decide to also use, for example, something called Archimate. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but Archimate is also an open group standard. And this open group standard provides you with a standard meta model for describing architecture products. So you could combine that with TOGAF and use TOGAF mainly as the way to actually execute the process, and use Archimate more as the language to express the actual products. So that's something you should define up front.
Great. We're getting questions on training. So do you have a little bit of information on the training, perhaps, Danny?
Well, of course, there's all sorts of trainings in TOGAF, in all sorts of forms. So it very much depends on what you want. So there's like 3-day trainings, there's 4-day, and there are 5-day trainings. In general, I think it very much also depends on your own learning style. So you could take a course in which you just lean back and consume all information. Other courses are much more into, well, getting you in discussion with others. And that's what I try to do in my own courses. So use the course more as a way to actually discuss the questions that people have and talk about how to actually do things.
Right, so there's a level 1 certification course and a level 2.
Yes,
I think the level 1 is 2 days and level 2 is 3 days, and you can combine them to the 5 or 4-day course, and it can also be delivered virtually. That's also one question we got.
Yes, in general, I would say go for both levels at once. So why do 2 courses if you can do it in once?
Mm-hmm.
And then because then you also need to read the book twice. So that's not very efficient, I would say. But
right. So can it be used as a standalone framework, TOGAF, is a question here, because there's so much discussion about the interaction with other frameworks in this presentation.
well, of course it can, but in practice, when you look at COBIT, there are a lot of IT processes, and all these IT processes need some form of governance and attention. So, and in general, even it is that the maturity level of IT governance very much also dictates the maturity level of a lot of other processes. So when you are at, say, a low maturity level with respect to IT governance, then probably you cannot become very mature in architecture. So I think you need to evolve all these processes at the same pace. So try to get at level 2 on a number of these processes. Because what I see failing a lot of times is that architects really have good ideas, but their ideas are not really used in the organizations. They are not really used to really make decisions. And in the end, that's what architecture should be about. And making decisions is what, well, that's what governance is about. So governance is really essential in when you want to make enterprise architecture and TOGAF work.
Right. And in your experience, Danny, how many organizations are using actually TOGAF? You know, how many organizations that use ITIL already? I mean, we know that almost any organization of a significant size is using or implementing TOGAF. Most of them use COBIT, but ITIL, I mean. But how many are using TOGAF?
Well, I don't have numbers, and also my perspective is mainly limited to the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
So most of my work is in the Netherlands, so I only see Dutch organizations. But in the Netherlands, I see almost all my clients looking at TOGAF minimally, because there's not really an alternative, you could say. I mean, this is the only standard freely available that describes enterprise architecture at this level of detail. So you should at least use it as a source of inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
And also well, again, combine it with other things. So what I see a lot of time with a lot of organizations in the Netherlands is that they combine it with Archimate.
Right.
So that's very complementary.
Right. And would you recommend having a larger understanding of applications and software architecture before working towards understanding TOGAF is a question we're getting here, especially for someone
Well,
coming from a technology background?
there's a yes and a no in there. Well, I come from that side, so I come very much from the software side, and that really helped me to understand what IT in all its details is about, and it allows me now to look at it from a much more abstract level. But the problem is that a lot of people that operate at more, say, the software architecture detailed level, they are very much focused on the technical details, and they find, say, the actual experience and knowledge that they have very important. Whilst if you look at what you really need to have in terms of skills when you do enterprise architecture, well, that's totally something different. I mean, there's much more focus there on soft skills, on actually communicating with people, on showing leadership. So it can also be a problem if you have like a very technical background. And in that sense, I believe that also people with very different backgrounds can still be very good architects.
Okay, that's clear. So there's a lot of companies, especially in the US, using COBIT now. So here's a question: how can we tell them that TOGAF would be a better option? That's an interesting one.
A better option for what? For COBIT?
Yeah, then COBIT instead of
Well,
COBIT.
I mean, they're complementary. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
COBIT provides a summary of TOGAF, so it's already in there.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
just point them to the details.
Yeah, it's probably better to just get the best out of both, right?
Well, you should use both. I
Right.
mean, there's no escape from that.
Here's I think, a final question. How about MSP and TOGAF? I think that is Microsoft Projects.
Well, I must say that I'm not very familiar with MSP, so I think I cannot tell you anything in detail about that. Um,
All right.
but I think a lot of things that we said about Prince2 also holds for that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so MSP provides you probably with a way of actually handling all the suggested projects that are the results of an enterprise architecture engagement.
Right. All right. I think that seems to be our final question. Yeah. So if neither of our panelists and well, if neither of you have anything to say, as well as the people attending, or any questions, then I would like to wrap up for today. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I know it's been a very interesting webinar with new perspectives for most people, as we saw that most people came from an ITIL background. So I think it will be interesting to see how we can work towards getting this white paper out released soon, where there's more in-depth information on all these process models that you have shown us in very much detail, but we didn't have much time to go into that. So it would be great to extend this discussion at a later time, and then maybe break it down into several subjects, of course, all the frameworks separately perhaps. So thank you, Danny, for your time and presentation today. We'll follow up by sending you a mail with a link to this recorded webinar, and we'll also share the slide deck, of course, and you can find more information on Global Knowledge website and also on our ITpreneurs website. So if you have any specific questions in depth, you can send us all emails. You can also send an email to Danny himself with specific questions if you have any